Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody, all my many viewers. We are getting into Exodus 21, the treatment of servants or slaves. I did quite a bit of research because I know this is an easy one for people to be like, oh, look, slavery, God is bad. Look at him, look what he allows, look what he allows. And I don't know, I don't have a lot of patience for that personally because I see God as God, and I don't look for a flaw in him because there isn't one. Other people can and other people will, but I see the justice that he shows us in how to live our lives because God always tells us to be in this world but not of it. So we have to understand that the things in this world we can participate in, much like Daniel has to do when he goes and serves under King Nebuchadnezzar and everything. The people, the Israelites that were taken, they're told to be a part of the community, to take place in the uh, culture and everything without losing God's law. You can be a part of the community in the area and the time that you live in without, so long as you hold true to God's law. We'll get into it here once I start reading, but I just had to touch on it. The fact that so many people will look at, the fact that there was slavery in the Old Testament and it's not forbidden as a way of saying that God is not a just God. Instead of looking at the fact that, for one, slavery was just a part of the time, you can say, oh, that's not a legitimate argument. Well, then I would say, like in my last video, what my liberal teacher taught me, that's a value judgment. You're putting your current day values on the past. You can't value judge other people. So let's think about this correctly. In ancient times, there was no factory jobs. There wasn't high manufacturing positions. There weren't delivery drivers. There wasn't tons of jobs. There wasn't a plumber, who had his apprentices. There wasn't a concrete company. There was none of this stuff, okay? You know how many jobs there were available? Hardly any. Almost none. It was up to you to make it on your own, usually starting by providing for yourself and your family and maybe growing some wealth outwards from there with crops and livestock and maybe your own skill that you could provide for others. But again, think about the number of people and the amount of jobs that would have been available at the time. Hardly any. You kind of needed somebody to take care of you. You needed somebody to work for. And that's what this is. It's explaining how to be a good master and a good servant. Because we're all, whether you want to admit it or not, we're all slaves. I don't know if you're aware of this, but slavery is somebody owning and making profit off of your labor that you don't necessarily agree to. Now, obviously, the company you work for, you agree that they will make money off of your labor, and in exchange, you will do this labor for a certain amount of rate. That's an agreed-upon contract. What isn't agreed upon is income taxes. Ever since income taxes, which is unconstitutional, were first introduced, was it for World War II, I think, or World War I, to pay for it and never taken away? Your labor is taxed without your consent. Your labor is taxed without your consent, and you are a slave. That is the definition of slavery. They are taking the labor, the money that you earn from your labor, and giving it to somebody else. Taking it from you forcefully. That's slavery. We're all slaves. Get used to it. That's why it just shocks me to the core when so many people look at the slavery in the Bible and they say that's an unjust God, instead of looking about the rules that are laid out of how it should be operated, realizing that slavery was just a part of the time. If there was no slavery, these people would probably die. Are you aware of that? Who's going to feed them? Who's going to take care of them? The reason most of them are slaves is because either their community, their society, their culture has been wiped out and they have nowhere to go, or because they're so poor they sell themselves into slavery. And we'll get into that. But no one wants to understand the culture at the time. No one wants to understand what's actually happening at the time of when they're reading. They just want to find something that they can value judge. According to all my liberal professors, that is not something you should do. All right, so on the screen I have King James, but I'm going to read from the New International Version because it's easier to understand some of this stuff. Verse 1, these are the laws you are to set before them, Hebrew servants. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free, without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. If a man sells... All right, let's stop right there. I'll keep going. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is to go free, as male servants could do. If she does not please the master, who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to a foreigner, because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his own, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these things, she is to go free without payment of money. Dry reading, I know, because it's just like a law book, okay? But let's, again, look at it from the people and the perspective of the time. I'm going to jump over here to in the Enduring Bible Commentary, because obviously I'm doing my own commentary, but I do research, and I like to see what everyone else is saying. So right here, this is just verse 2 through 4 that we read, and it's talking about if his master has given him a wife, she has borne him sons, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So basically, in the beginning here, the commentary is explaining that that a lot of people who are ignorant blame the Bible for institution of slavery, for starting slavery, which is not the case. Slavery is going on. They're making laws on how to appropriately own slaves, how to appropriately have servants working under you. Again, there aren't jobs at this time. There's no manufacturing companies. This isn't available. You want to work for someone, usually when you become so poor that you sell yourself into slavery so that you can have food provided for you, so they can do all this stuff. At the same time, you can be saving up, because you're at the end of 6 years, you're set free. It's like indentured servitude. You agree to it so that you don't have to worry about personal expenses for a few years, so that somebody will provide you with food and care and clothing. Yes, you'll have to work for them, but at the same time, you can earn your own money on the side, doing your own thing, save up for a while. And when you are done, that's 6 years where you didn't have to pay for anything. You could have saved up, and now you have a head start in life. The laws concerning slavery made on purpose to repress it. See, they're already making rules to it which didn't exist anymore. The Torah accepts slavery as an inevitable part of ancient society, much as Paul did, but the new humanitarian approach will ultimately be the death knell of slavery. In any case, slavery in Israel was rural, domestic, and small scale. It is significant that the first words of this section of law of the book of Exodus, God wanted Israel to respect the rights and dignity of servants. So right here, in extreme poverty, you could sell yourself into slavery. So you could set yourself up for 6 years of no expenses. I look at it, other than the fact that you get paid, but it's kind of like the military. You know, I did the military. That's kind of the way it is. You basically have no expenses for a few years, and you can save up. Now, obviously, they're paying you. Usually not what... It's usually less than what the work you're doing, especially if you're an engineer. You're doing way more than what they're paying you for. But you don't have any expenses. And you know, you can save money on the side. You still have time at night and everything, and you're still basically free to go around. Like, it wasn't slavery the way that we see it as in America. That wasn't the way slavery was. They were servants. So at the end of the day, they weren't confined to quarters and not allowed to go mingle. You know, they were allowed to walk around. That's why there's laws on how you had to treat slaves in public and everything. Again, a father might sell a daughter as a servant into a home with the intention that she would eventually marry into that family. So it's a lot like royal societies back in the day would send their daughters to be a lady in waiting or in court for a king or a duke or something, so that other people would in their family or that were in that court would see her and be aware of her so that she could find a good match. Now, if you don't have a lot of money, you can sell your daughter to work and be a servant for another wealthier family. And the whole intention is that hopefully she'll marry one of that family's sons or one of their cousins or something along those lines. And there's even rules right here where it talks about that if the girl isn't married or she displeases him in some way, he can't just like stop providing her with food. He can't stop providing her with shelter and stop taking care of her. And she's allowed to leave. He can't sell her again. She has to go back to her father because it's more of a lady-in-waiting thing with the females. And if he marries another woman, he must not deprive her, the first one, of food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these things, she is to go free without any payment of money. So she goes, she works, hopefully she finds a husband. If not, she is allowed to go home for free or continue to be provided for. Again, there's so many people, be fruitful and multiply, they don't have jobs. They don't have anything to do. And not everybody, as much as it pains me to admit, not everybody's able to just take care of themselves. Not everybody can just, go and homestead and grow their own food and become prosperous. Some people need that helping hand. Some people need someone to give them boundaries and give them order in life and give them things to do. Otherwise, they kind of fall apart and they fall into sin very easily. I'm just different, I guess. I don't see all this stuff as harsh. I see it as kind. I understand the way the world really is. There's going to be people who need to have structure. They need to have that are servants. We're all a servant to somebody. Now, your true master, of course, should always be God. And as long as that's the case, you're never truly a slave. And as long as that's the case, you're never a tyrannical master. But that doesn't mean that here on earth there aren't like pecking orders. There isn't a rank system. And you need to be aware of it. And you need to know how to be a good leader, a good master. And you need to know how to be a good servant, a good follower, a good bravo. All right, so moving on. You serve for a certain amount of time. It's just like on the Sabbath, the seventh day is the day of rest. You get to be set free. Okay, here we go. But if the servant, I already read this, plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children. Because that's kind of harsh. Oh no, why? He married this woman, and at the end of his slavery, servitude, he doesn't get to go home with her. That's if he married someone that his master gave to him. Now, this is kind of an underhanded way that, a master could take advantage of it to lure people to stay with them, But it's no different than, using benefits for a company to get you to stay at a job that you don't really like. That's the way I see it. And the benefit here is a wife and kids that you love. Are you willing to stay here and work maybe where you don't want to for these wife and kids? You didn't have to marry them. You didn't have to take them. But if you married one of that master's servants and you don't want to leave her. Now, of course, the master can let her go. He doesn't have to say, no, she's staying with me. I'm sure that happened plenty of times. But he has a right to keep her because she's already agreed to be his servant. They've already set this contract in motion. He can let her go, but he doesn't have to. But if you truly love her, you can agree to stay and work for that master. And I'm guessing this happened quite a bit because, again, a lot of people probably didn't want to go off on their own. This isn't slavery like deep souths getting whipped and have to live in your shack and you can't go out into polite society or anything. No, all this means is that you have to obey your master, but you're not a prisoner. It's not like people were shipped over from Africa to this land. The slave trade is totally different than what they're talking about here. People don't even understand that because they don't know history, because public schools are worthless. All right. His master shall bring him to the judges. His master shall pierce his ear, then all. He shall serve him forever. What's it say for that? Jesus gave us the right to be called friends instead of servants. Oh yeah, that's another big thing, and we'll get into it because as you'll see, we progress through the Bible from Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. The laws get more and more strict on slavery and the way to treat slaves is more and more liberal. And one of the big arguments against the Bible is most of the laws specifically, they have two different types of slaves. There's the Hebrew slaves, which a lot of what we're talking about pertains to. There's the non-Hebrew slaves. Non-Hebrew slaves don't necessarily get freed. They don't have all the same benefits, but the rules on how to treat them are still there. You still have to treat them with respect. You can't just do whatever you want to them. And this is actually used a lot, that why Africans were allowed to be our slaves, because they weren't Israelites, or they were of a different people. And that's the way a lot of these laws were in the old times, that if they were of a different people, if they were captive or something of this sort, there was different laws appropriated to you for those people than through the Hebrew slaves. And you can look at that again as being like harsh and I look at it as being realistic. I mean, most of the people that they're capturing, they're like sun worshippers and sacrifice people. Like, if you just set those people free, they're going to go back to practicing wicked ways. Because whether you want to believe it or not, they believed it. They believed that sacrifice led to immortality or the worship of gods. They believe a lot of this heathenistic, terrible stuff. So if they believe it, they're going to go back to it. They're not going to just continue to live as Hebrews live. And if they do want to continue to live as Hebrews live, they're probably pretty happy with the fact that, they have everything provided for them, and these kind, peaceful people are taking care of them in a way that even when they were free in their homeland, the government or the tyrannical system they're under didn't let them live in such a way. No one wants to think about that once again. All right, we're going to move on. Verse 12. Anyone who strikes a person... this is personal injuries. Your personal injury lawyer. Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they are to flee to a place I will designate. But if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. Manslaughter, first, second degree murder, right there. We get a lot of this stuff seriously straight from the Old Testament. That right there just described to you manslaughter, murder 1, murder 2. I don't care if you're for or against the death penalty. In this time and age, the resources were not available for you to keep a lifelong prisoner. And you had to be harsh with this stuff. I don't care what you say, spare the rod, spoil the child. If in the beginning, when God's first teaching his people his laws and his commandments, if he's not harsh, they're not going to follow it. They're not going to be respected by it. If he didn't tell them that, hey, if you even touch this Mount Sinai while I'm up there with Moses, you will surely die. You must not touch it, not even touch it or death. Same thing here. You have to make the punishment harsh, especially early on. You have to teach it. Otherwise, if it's not a big punishment, first off, they're not even going to really care that much, but they're also not going to understand the divinity, the power, the majesty, and the almightiness of God. You have to, especially early on, make the lines clear in the sand. Make the punishments severe. Maybe times have evolved, and we see that through the Bible, that as the people evolve, God makes the laws more and more strict. Because remember, the original 10 Commandments are pretty strict. And the more and more we get closer to Jesus' golden rule of love thy neighbor as thyself and keep God above all things, so the closer we get to that golden rule, which encompasses everything, the more and more we start to understand that, things like slavery and mercy and forgiveness. But you have to start with hard lines in the sand. It's like having a child. You can't, explain the in-depths of everything to them right from the get-go. They're not going to get it. And Israel has to start basically all over from everything they've forgotten in Egypt. They have to basically start all over. And that, I forgot to mention it when I was talking about non-Hebrew slaves, understand when Christ came, there were no more Jews and Gentiles. There were believers and non-believers. And what the believers are to do is to go out and seek the non-believers to give them the message, to hopefully try and persuade them to the message. So the whole argument of if there ever was one, of non-Hebrew slavery still, or servitude still being a thing that we should practice, that argument doesn't hold up if you're a Christian, because Christ wiped away the Jews versus Gentiles. All right. Verse 15, anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. A lot of death, right? Well, those are pretty serious crimes. I mean, attacking your mother or father, kidnapping someone, cursing your father or mother. And again, cursing isn't just like chewing them out. But understand, whether you believed it or not, they believed it. And so did the cultures around them in actual curses. In people being cursed. You know, you going to some weird shaman type dude and having your family cursed. You don't have to believe it. They believed it. And if you did that, whether it really worked or didn't is irrelevant. If you believed you were going to a witch or a shaman to curse your family, you in your heart, you just committed the crime, whether it works or not. You know, you wanted to curse your family for whatever nefarious reasons. So, again, they don't have the resources to set up giant prisons and feed and take care of these people forever. These are terrible people that if we let go, they're going to continue to do things. Awful things. They don't understand the mercy and the forgiving power of Christ. Not yet. People will be like, oh, look at all the death. I'm like, are you even trying to analyze the situation at all? If people quarrel and one person... I'm sorry, this is verse 18. If people quarrel and one person hits another with a stone or with their fist, and the victim does not die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held liable if the other can get up and walk around outside with a staff. However, the guilty party must pay the injured person for any loss of time and see that the victim is completely healed. Okay. There's forgiveness. I mean, we still look at a lot of these laws. I think a lot of stuff would work better, not necessarily the killing and the death penalty for everything, but like this. Instead of someone being punished and going to jail for a fist fight or something, that person has to pay for any damages or be that person's servant until they can pay off the debt and make sure that that person is completely healed. So you got to pay for their medical expenses. You know, don't send them to prison. Put them to work. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Okay. Do say what you will, they had laws, especially we'll read later on, of justification for hitting your slave. But I won't get into that because that's not the chapter we're going over. Again, oh, look at that, that's harsh, that's harsh. I don't see it that way. Again, since there are plenty of laws of the way a master should treat their servant and justify, the masters on average aren't just beating them. Okay? In fact, it was very frowned upon, very like, what the hell are you doing if you beat your slave? At all. Certainly if you beat him to death, then you will be punished. Now, you will be shamed even if you beat your slave, because you shouldn't do that. The reason that it's put in there, and people, oh, it's so awful, it's so awful. What you need to realize is a lot of these people are the dregs of society. Not all of them. A lot of them are just in a down and out place. But a lot of them are in the dregs of society. They're people that would be in prison anyway. In today's society, they would be put in prison. I still think it would be better, especially for some people, if we had things like the stocks or the whipping board for certain crimes. I think that would be far more effective and efficient than our current prison system. Say what you will, but I do think so. So if a slave is committing a crime or doing something nefarious or terrible, it's no different than any other person doing those things. The crime for those people would be similar. They would have some sort of punishment within the society. So the fact that slaves should be exempt from that, it doesn't make sense. You know, again, it doesn't say it here, so we won't go into detail, but you can't just beat your slave for any reason. They put it in here because this is the specific topic they're talking about right now. Moving on. Again, people will be like, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. just try to analyze the situation with the knowledge of the history of the time, the values, the culture, everything that's going on at the time. Not just reading the verse and putting it into today's society like an ignorant. Verse 22, if people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. Okay, so if you're struggling and a woman gets hit and she gives birth prematurely because of it and there's no damage to the child, you still have to pay a fine to what the husband deems necessary. Again, they're assuming in the society, that's the part that a lot of people forget, is all these laws are assuming in the society that people are generally already following God's law. So the law earlier about beating your slave and you'll be punished if you beat him to death, that's already generally assumed that you're not beating your slave, especially not just for any reason whatsoever. Make sure it has to be a severe reason, even no matter how severe. Let's say does something terrible, I don't know, steals from you or some nonsense like that, and you whip them or you beat them with a rod and they die, you are punished still. Because the understanding is that they're not going to do that sort of thing. It's understanding that you already live in a somewhat just, righteous, loving society. Same thing here. Look at the way we treat pregnancy now, and abortion up to pregnancy basically in New York and stuff. But here, even if you punch on accident a woman and she gives birth prematurely and there's no damage to the child, the husband still gets to say how much you owe them. And that's assuming that you live in a relatively just and honest society. The husband's not going to overcharge you because they're just saying it's up to the husband. Now, husband could be nefarious and say, give me everything. But they're assuming, they're writing these laws with the understanding that people are generally good. Now, that might have been their mistake, because we see that people aren't generally good. But that's the understanding you have to look at it with. Verse 23, but if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. I always like that when people say the eye for an eye quote, which we'll find in the New Testament again, and it's a little bit, it's being referenced to back here. But they're specifically talking here about harming a child. The eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand originates when you're talking about harming an unborn child. Be aware of that. Does that say that that's the only place it applies in the Old Testament? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it originates when talking about harming an unborn child. That's where the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth comes from. It doesn't come from one person, because we read earlier about, when one person kills another person, that person is to be put to death. But it doesn't say eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth there. It says it when they're talking about harming an unborn child and the punishment that should happen if injuries come from that harm. Kind of weird. People just overlook that whatever the injury that comes to this unborn child when they are born is the injury that you will face. Verse 28, if a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death and its meat must not be eaten, but the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. I like how the meat is not supposed to be eaten. Remember at that time, who, and maybe they're right. I think they're right most of the time, but Christ sends demons into pigs. We see that demons possess things all the time. If a bull is goring a human, that's pretty uncommon. Maybe they weren't supposed to eat the meat because the meat was spoiled in some way. Not even necessarily by a demon, but think about things like mad cow disease and stuff like that that could have been going on. A lot of these laws are based on keeping people healthy. So you don't eat that meat because my guess is God was aware of things like mad cow disease, and he didn't want that stuff to be entered into their camp or community. Verse 29, if, however, the bull has had a habit of goring, and the owner has been warned, but has not kept it pinned up, and it kills a man or a woman, the bull is to be stoned, and its owner also is to be put to death. However, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or a daughter. If the bull gores a male or a female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull is to be stoned to death. Okay, so I kind of like that. If you're a prick, if you've been warned, if you've been given warnings about, because we all know people like this, that they just ignore it, they don't care about the people around them, and they just say whatever. Well, that could bite you in the butt big time. If you have an animal that is known to be violent, you haven't done anything to keep it pinned up, and it hurts somebody, it's on you. Now, if that animal isn't known to hurt people and it just happens randomly one time, no harm, no foul. But you could be killed, or if you could buy your way out of it, which is typically what happened in those times. Is they weren't killed because people would rather have money than kill another person, So they typically ask for payment. And then obviously this applies to sons and daughters as well. And as for our slaves go, you have to pay for those. Again, people are like, oh, they don't see the value in human life. I think they do. I think they do see the value in human life. I guess it's a different perspective. The rules that they set forth on how to treat all people show me that they have a value for human life. What I don't see is the same is everyone else's value, I guess, of human life is a little bit different. When you understand in a God, in an afterlife, when you understand that this world isn't the end-all be-all, death isn't as big of a deal. Now, it's still something that obviously is a big enough deal to have some punishment behind, but it's not the same thing when you understand that there's an afterlife. Verse 33, if anyone uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it up, another jerk, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the one who opened the pit must pay the owner for the loss and take the dead animal in exchange. If anyone's bull injures someone else's bull and it dies, the two parties are to sell the live one and divide both money and dead animals equally. However, if it was known that the bull had the habit of goring, yet the owner did not keep it pinned up like a jerk, the owner must pay, animal for animal, and take the dead animal in exchange. Don't be a jerk. That's what those last two say to me. Be responsible, and concern yourself with the well-being of others. That's what this whole thing is about. Be concerned with the well-being of others. Even if they're a servant, even if they're low class, whatever you want to call it, even if they're a slave, you still have concern for others. When you dig a pit, cover it. Don't be a jerk. When you have an animal that's a bit violent, keep it pinned up. Don't be a jerk. And I've said everything I have to say already about this and about slavery. I know tons of people disagree with me. I have this talk with a lot of my friends all the time. I guess I just see it differently. People say I have biased blinders on for the Bible or for God or for Christianity. Yeah, obviously. Duh. That only makes sense. We all have our biases. I see the other side of the argument. I just disagree with it. I think this shows a just and loving God that cares for everyone. Other people disagree. That's up to them. But I will say this. It's much better life to believe in a just, caring God, and things make much more sense than when you think that God is maniacal or when you deny his existence in general. Because a maniacal God doesn't make sense in this world that has everything provided for us. And a non-existent God doesn't make sense because matter can't self-create. All right, everyone have a wonderful afternoon, evening, or good night. God bless.